I'm going to take you seriously.
Don't ever do
walking,
that.
What
Right.
we do is select out of the 500 little all totally connected, unseparated actions. We select those actions which we can use to show the action itself. Now, what sequential art depends on is an intellectual understanding between you and the reader. So we have the man walking down the street here with a bow tie, and between him and here, there's another action in which he's perhaps looking back at somebody back there.
Who said, how come you're wearing that bow tie?
Yeah, well, hey, Charlie, what are you wearing that bow tie for?
See, I know you never do anything without a reason. And when you said there's a man with a bow tie, you had to have established that for some reason, I figure.
That's what makes you the great editor.
Go ahead.
And you will see at this point we're going to make the swing of the nostril, the curve of that nostril arch, the opening of the nasal passage, and then the wing of the nose, held at the top just above that arc, gives us the width of the nose. That eye never encroaches any further in except from the point where the wing of the nose ends. Next problem here is the arch of the brow. The arch of the brow is clearly like the visor I told you about, and it does make the form complete when it provides a protection to the eye. Here at the top, we have the big brow ridge. As it dips, it goes and swells to the outside, off on our right, and then the great cranial mass intrudes, and we have the form now complete. Let's look now at the characteristic forms of the cheekbone.
Hey, Satanico here once again for God Loves Comics, and this is Burne Hogarth versus Will Eisner, A Feast of Maggots. Burne Hogarth on Will Eisner competing for an award named after him. Quote, "Boy, I'll tell you there's something disgusting about that kind of behavior. I look upon that and I shudder, as if I'm looking at the belly of a dog with a burgeoning mound of maggots." Of course, Eisner and Hogarth were contemporaries throughout the golden age of comics, and both are legends within the medium, albeit legends with very different strengths. Eisner revolutionized page layouts and compositions, brilliantly incorporating story titles into the landscape of his most famous creation, the Spirit, in ways so innovative they influenced generations of subsequent creators, including quite notably Frank Miller. Hogarth, meanwhile, gained fame as an almost unapproachable master of dynamic anatomy, and is now remembered more for a series of impressive instructional tomes on human anatomy, dramatic lighting and shading, than for his comics work. Will Eisner also dominated bookshelves in his own scholarly capacity. For decades, there was nary a single comic book publisher's submissions form that did not recommend new creators learn about storytelling from Eisner's legendary book, Comics and Sequential Art. Similarly, Hogarth's foundational anatomy books all but leapt from the shelves of the art technique sections of bookstores, where amid a flood of utter garbage, like Christopher Hart's ubiquitous how-to hack jobs, Hogarth's work looked akin to Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. In fact, it looked like the old masters even without that awful comparison to Hart's preschool-level hack work. Eisner and Hogarth clearly ran in the same circles, as there are photos of the two pictured together at panels and gatherings, and often with other luminaries from Karl Barks to Harvey Kurtzman to young French firebrands like Mobius and Philippe Drouillet. So unquestionably, Eisner and Hogarth respected one another's immense skills, even if their approaches and oeuvres were dramatically different. All of which makes Hogarth's colorful animus all the more personal. While it certainly smacks of more than a touch of competitive jealousy, Hogarth's Feast of Maggots quote also has ample validity when viewed in context. Now here is the full quote. "Will Eisner lends his name to a great prize for all the cartoonists in the current period, and everybody, including Eisner, is vying to get an Eisner Award. It's like Alfred Nobel competing with other people to get a Nobel Prize. So Eisner competes against his own Confederates and colleagues in the field. He can win an Eisner Award. Can you imagine the paltry significance of that kind of shabby activity? Boy, I'll tell you, it's something disgusting about that kind of behavior. I look upon that and I shudder as if I'm looking at the belly of a dog with a burgeoning mound of maggots. It makes me feel like it's feeding on rotten flesh to make this kind of event that really should go to the people who are competing and don't have the experience that he's got and the money that he's piled up. Here is Eisner competing for the Will Eisner Prize. Can you believe that? Isn't that a redundancy of the most egregious kind? I look upon that as if anybody ever nominated me for that, I'd say take it, keep it, and shove it. That's Burne Hogarth speaking to Gary Groth in the Comics Journal 167, 1994. Of course, Hogarth never got that opportunity, but was instead inducted posthumously into the Will Eisner Comic Awards Hall of Fame alongside Bob Montana in 2010. Montana, who died in 1975, was a co-creator of Archie and drew the Riverdale Gang for 3 decades. Hogarth died in 1996, just 2 years after publication of that TCJ interview. However, in 1987, the first inductees into the Eisner Hall of Fame were Carl Barks, Jack Kirby, and you guessed it, Will Eisner, a full 23 years before Hogarth's induction. But while Eisner being placed in his own Hall of Fame seems all but an academic inevitability, I scanned the Eisner Awards wondering how egregious they may have been as regards Hogarth's charge of an onanistic award, assuming that even if Eisner were nominated, he may not have won any Eisners in his lifetime. At first I saw nothing, and then suddenly I began spotting Eisner's name with great frequency, not merely as a nominee, but also as a winner. Aside from his induction into the Eisner Hall of Fame in 1987, which allowed him to enjoy his honor for nearly 2 decades before his death, Will Eisner, unironically, did in fact win a host of Eisners. There was 1992's The Heart of the Storm for Best Graphic Album New. There was 1994's Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award. There was 1995's The Christmas Spirit, Best Archival Collection for Kitchen Sink. There was 2002's The Name of the Game for Best Graphic Album. There was 2006 Eisner and Miller, edited by Charles Brownstein and Diana Schutz, Best Comics Related Book. In 2014, Will Eisner's The Spirit Artist Edition, edited by Scott Dunbier of IDW, Best Archival Collection and Project. 2019, Will Eisner's A Contract with God, Curator's Collection, designed by John Lind for Kitchen Sink and Dark Horse, Best Publication Design. Of course, 3 of these did come only after Eisner's death and were primarily awards for editors and publishers. Nevertheless, Will Eisner did win a passel of Eisners, which must have irritated the hell out of one Burne Hogarth, who was alive for the first 3 of them. And now just a little more of that 1994 interview. Gary Groth, did you follow Eisner's work in the 1940s? Hogarth, yeah, I remember his work on the Spirit. I thought he had done a very courageous thing when it came out with the Spirit very early on as an insert in the newspapers, publishing it himself. Groth, so you thought pretty highly of his work? Hogarth, I thought it was competent. I don't know whether I thought of it that highly. The thing I thought was very good in that particular comic section was Miss Fury by Tarp Mills. I thought that was one hell of a damn good piece of adventure mystery that she was dishing up. It seemed there was something fresh about it. The Spirit to me was like the Phantom. I couldn't understand this guy walking around in a business suit with a hat and his hands in his pockets and strolling down the street with a mask. Can you imagine how bizarre that is? Talk about reality principles, unquote. Not to belabor the obvious, but firstly, Hogarth's most famous work was on Tarzan, in which a man swung around the jungle in nothing more than a leopard print bikini bottom. This was a perfect template to display Hogarth's mastery of anatomy and human musculature, and not exactly a reinforcement of reality principles, whatever those may be. And then there is the praise of Tarp Mills, a rare female artist in the Golden Age alongside Lily Renee and Marie Severin, if you count her being a colorist at EC. Tarp Mills' work absolutely had charm and flair, but Miss Fury prances around in a catsuit and a mask as well, which hardly seems any more credible than the Spirit's rather believable suit coat and fedora. Additionally, Hogarth seems to give no quarter for the simple visual panache, noting Eisner's hands in the pockets motif, nor to other design elements endemic to such a great comic, or indeed to most comic work, including his own. Now in the 21st century, it seems that while Eisner remains perpetually relevant, that Hogarth sadly often appears forgotten and rarely mentioned in the current comics firmament. It was Eisner, after all, who in his later years always kept one foot in the rising indie comic scene and was a bastion of encouragement for young artists. Conversely, although Hogarth was a welcomed presence at France's massive Angoulême Comics Festival, he was always more of an obvious elitist with a get-off-my-lawn vibe one would expect from an irascible Golden Age artist of such enormous technical prowess. It's hard to imagine Hogarth ever appearing at the Small Press Expo and doing anything more than laughing or sneering at the works of Jeffrey Brown, Brian Ralph, or James Kocholka. But in his latter decade, Eisner never hesitated to rub elbows with the photocopying riffraff of the indie comic scene. Attending SPX in the early 2000s, only a few years before his death in 2005, Eisner attracted a steady pilgrimage of admirers and transparent networkers, ranging from Matt Madden and Jessica Abell to James Sturm, the eventual co-founder of Vermont's Center for Cartoon Studies, which still ably caters to the woke and wealthy wannabe cartoonist. An MFA from CCS's 2-year program will set each student back a minimum of $50,000, or more than most cartoonists will ever make from their work in their lifetime. But at least mom and dad are footing the bill with the hopes that their screwy kid doesn't fall prey to an opioid addiction. Nevertheless, as the local Vermont magazine stated, many CCS students go on to create award-winning books and comics, including some that have won Eisner Awards, which are, quote, the Oscars of the cartoon world, unquote. Writing for the Atlantic magazine, Stephen Heller, a professor at the Competing School of Visual Arts, SVA, lauded CCS, quote, judging by the student newspaper, Cartoon Crier, a slew of influences from Art Spiegelman's brilliant and deliberate use of comics' formal elements to Chris Ware's narrative precision pervade the CCS halls, unquote. Yes, that is quite an expansive gamut of comics there, from the moderately accessible snobbery of Spiegelman to the entirely niche and inaccessible snobbery of Ware. But make no mistake, some of CCS's graduates were busily consuming Rob Liefeld comics and would even emerge to draw comics about girls on skateboards, although this too would land them a comics Oscar. Thus, even as Will Eisner, still sprightly in his twilight years, sat down to breakfast in a hotel restaurant hosting SPX with his wife, James Sturm pounced, practically sitting in Eisner's lap to show him a portfolio of original art for Sturm's graphic novel about baseball, Gollum's Mighty Swing. Eisner affably studied the pages, while his breakfast grew cold, and clearly rained praise on Sturm's work without ever appearing annoyed by the brazen intrusion. All of which brings us back to those Oscars of the comics world, the Eisner Awards, and to the magnificently irascible Burne Hogarth, who found the very presence of the Eisners onanistic, if not nepotistic. While it is undeniably fantastic that an artist as deserving as Will Eisner was honored with an annual award in his name while he was still very much alive, it becomes a bit complicated by the fact that Eisner himself was still very active in the comic book realm. So essentially, with each new work, Eisner was competing for an award with his own name against significantly younger and lesser cartoonists. It's as if writers nominated for the Mark Twain Literary Award found themselves competing against Twain himself, who was out touting his latest novel, Barnstorming Down the Mississippi by Raft. A particularly apt comparison because Eisner has the same stature in comics that Twain holds in literature, and Eisner also possessed a similar good humor and charm. Meanwhile, Burne Hogarth, alternately pompous, imperious, and prickly, was not nearly so renowned for his charm offensives. However, Hogarth is completely valid in finding absurdity in the premise of a living legend such as Will Eisner frequently competing for his own award. But there's no accounting for the level of vitriolic rhetoric he uses in which to voice his bemused opposition. Still, in these days of sleazy, glad-handing, back-patting, networking K-fakes, always kissing ass and taking names for their Rolodex, Hogarth's academic snark concerning an equally towering peer remains refreshing. Just try not to think of the Maggots.